Give me food, and I'll heal your wife." Those words echoed like thunder in Richard Blackwell's mind as he stared at the ragged man standing outside Mount Sinai Hospital. The billionaire, a man used to commanding financial empires, now felt utterly powerless in the face of his beloved wife Margaret's death sentence. For 3 months, the world's top doctors had declared her case hopeless, a degenerative neurological condition that was slowly consuming her. Now, standing under the freezing December rain, Richard questioned whether he was losing his sanity by even considering the words of a total stranger. The homeless veteran looked like nothing more than a man broken by time and circumstance. His tangled grey hair, his clothes heavy with the weight of countless nights spent out in the open, but there was something in his eyes, a disturbing clarity that clashed violently with his ruined appearance. When he repeated his bizarre offer, "A simple meal, and I'll save her life," Richard felt a chill crawl down his spine. There was an unshakable conviction in the man's voice, as if he held secrets the medical world had yet to uncover. Richard had built a billion-dollar empire by reading people, by spotting opportunities where others saw only dead ends. His fortune had been forged through calculated risks and razor-sharp instincts that rarely failed him. But now, standing before this mysterious veteran, all his mental algorithms were failing miserably. How could a man who clearly had nowhere to sleep possess medical knowledge that eluded the brightest minds in modern medicine? The question pounded in his consciousness as the rain intensified, casting a cinematic haze around them. The proposal sounded like the delusion of someone lost in his own madness, yet something about the veteran's posture suggested the opposite of insanity. His movements were precise, deliberate, and when he specifically mentioned atypical progressive neurological syndrome, Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. Those were technical terms known only to a handful of specialists, let alone a seemingly ordinary homeless man. The billionaire found himself torn between the rationality that had built his empire and the growing desperation that had devoured him since Margaret's diagnosis. And now, an impossible spark of hope began to flicker in the darkness of his agony. The impossible offer hung in the air like a divine promise or a cruel illusion, and Richard Blackwell stood divided between the ruthless logic that had ruled his life and the despair that gnawed at him from within. Margaret was on the 10th floor of that hospital, hooked up to machines that merely prolonged the inevitable, while he considered the words of a complete stranger. The veteran waited patiently for his answer, and there was something disturbingly familiar about his mannerisms, as if they had met once before in some long-forgotten moment in time. When Richard finally asked, "How do you know about my wife's condition?" the answer he received shook his world to its core. "I know because I've seen this case before, and I know exactly where the other doctors went wrong." The veteran's words carried a scientific weight that defied his ruined appearance, as if decades of medical knowledge were trapped inside a body beaten down by the streets. He described with surgical precision the symptoms Margaret had displayed over the past few months: the subtle seizures, the progressive memory loss, the increasingly frequent episodes of confusion. None of this information had been released to the press, kept in strict secrecy by the Blackwell family. How could this man possibly know such intimate details about a medical condition that even experts struggled to fully grasp? With each precise word, Richard felt his rational defenses collapse like sandcastles in a storm. Then the veteran did something that left the billionaire completely stunned. He pulled from his tattered coat a small notebook, its pages yellowed with age and stained by the rain of countless sleepless nights. With hands that trembled slightly, he revealed hand-drawn neurological diagrams, complex chemical equations, and notes written in advanced medical terminology. "This condition has a very specific treatment window," the man murmured, "and your wife is approaching the point of no return." His words sliced through the cold air like a razor's edge, and Richard felt time accelerate around him, as if every second lost might mean the difference between life and death. The rain continued to fall mercilessly as Richard struggled to process the impossibility of the situation, but an inescapable truth began to emerge from his subconscious. This man was no ordinary street charlatan. There was too much precision in his words, too much specific knowledge in his observations. The veteran closed his notebook and tucked it back into his coat, then locked his piercing eyes on Richard's. "I need a hot meal and access to her medical records, but I must warn you, what I'm going to propose goes against everything the doctors believe to be possible." The suspense between them was almost tangible, and Richard knew he was about to make the most important decision of his life, a choice that could either save Margaret or destroy his last hope forever. The mysterious veteran's past began to unfold like the pages of a long-forgotten book, and the revelation Richard was about to receive would forever change the way he saw the man standing before him. As they walked toward the nearest cafe from the hospital, the veteran murmured his name almost inaudibly. Dr. Samuel Hayes, former Army neurosurgeon, specialist in complex brain trauma. "Duh." The words fell from his lips like painful confessions, burdened by a weight that seemed to crush his hunched shoulders. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him, a military doctor, not a mere homeless man, but someone who had once saved lives with the same precision, now buried beneath years of hardship and cold nights on the street. The story Samuel shared between hesitant sips of hot coffee was a Shakespearean tragedy that explained his fall from the heights of medicine to the depths of urban despair. He had served in Afghanistan for 8 years, saving hundreds of soldiers from devastating brain injuries, developing revolutionary surgical techniques that would later be studied in universities around the world. But one operation had changed everything. An experimental procedure on a young soldier that resulted in unexpected complications, leading to the soldier's death and a military investigation that destroyed Samuel's career. "I never forgave myself for that loss," Samuel whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he held the cup. "And when I came home, I realized I couldn't touch a scalpel again without reliving that terrible moment." The psychological trauma had manifested as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, transforming one of the most promising neurosurgeons of his generation into a man haunted by nightmares and unbearable guilt. Samuel lost his medical license, then his home, his family, and finally his identity, wandering the streets like a ghost of the man he once was. "But even on the streets, I never stopped studying," he revealed, once again pulling out his yellowed notebook. "I kept researching, learning, trying to find answers to the cases that haunted me." Richard now saw that he was sitting across from a medical genius destroyed by his own hands, a man who carried within him the knowledge to save lives, but believed himself unworthy of ever wielding that power again. The irony struck Richard like lightning in the middle of the storm. The man who might save Margaret was the very one who considered himself responsible for taking a life. Samuel looked up from his coffee and fixed his gaze on the billionaire, and in his eyes was a devastating mix of hope and terror. "Your wife has the same neurological condition I've obsessively studied ever since I left medicine," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "And I discovered something no active physician knows, a therapeutic window that closes within a matter of hours." The suspense thickened like fog around them, as Richard realized he was facing not just the possibility of saving Margaret, but also the chance to redeem a man who had lost himself in the shadows of his once brilliant past. Richard Blackwell's hesitation was palpable, like a physical force filling the small cafe, as he wrestled with decades of logical thinking and the growing desperation that threatened to consume his sanity. The world's top oncologists and neurologists had been unequivocal. Margaret had at most 2 weeks to live, and any intervention at this point would be either futile or cruel. Yet here was a broken man, a former genius of medicine, offering hope where everyone else saw only inevitable death. "How can I trust someone who admits to losing a patient and abandoning medicine?" Richard asked, his voice heavy with anguish, knowing that each word was a dagger to Samuel's already wounded heart. "Judy?" Samuel Hayes did not look away, accepting the pain of the question as a deserved penance. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a conviction that transcended his deteriorated appearance. "Because sometimes, Mr. Blackwell, it's the doctors who failed that truly understand the cost of every decision." He opened his notebook once more, revealing pages covered in complex calculations, neurological diagrams that looked like maps of uncharted territories within the human mind. "I spent 5 years on the streets studying cases like your wife's because the guilt wouldn't let me rest. And I discovered that there is a specific combination of medications that can reverse the degenerative process, but only if applied at the precise moment." The words hung in the air like an impossible promise, challenging everything Richard believed about medicine and miracles. The first undeniable sign that Samuel Hayes was not just a delusional, homeless man came when he described Margaret's full medical history with surgical precision, including details Richard himself wasn't fully aware of. "Your wife suffered a minor stroke at the age of 42, so subtle it went unnoticed by doctors at the time. But it left a microscopic scar on her prefrontal cortex," Samuel murmured, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as though reading invisible data. Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. He remembered that incident 15 years ago during a business trip to Tokyo. Margaret had never shown serious symptoms, and it had seemed like nothing. How could this man know something so specific, buried deep in her medical past? Samuel continued his devastatingly precise analysis, explaining how that microscopic lesion had triggered a cascade of neurological events that lay dormant for over a decade. Tau protein began accumulating abnormally around the scar, creating a pattern of degeneration that current doctors mistake for a typical neurological disease, he explained, sketching diagrams on a cafe napkin with such precision that Richard began to question reality itself. "But it's not a common disease, it's a specific reaction to the old injury, and that means it can be stopped if we target the primary source of inflammation." Each technical word left Samuel's mouth with the authority of someone who had spent years immersed in the study of exactly that phenomenon, slowly transforming Richard's skepticism into a disturbing mixture of hope and fear. Richard's decision to bring Samuel to the hospital was made in a moment of pure desperation that overpowered decades of rational thought, like a man leaping off a cliff, hoping someone had stretched an invisible net below. Using his influence and connections, he secured access to Margaret's medical records through a personal favor from the hospital director, Dr. Morrison, a long-time acquaintance. "Are you sure you know what you're doing, Richard?" Morrison asked, genuine concern in his voice as he watched the billionaire arrive, accompanied by a man who looked anything but credible. "He says he's a doctor, but—" Richard cut him off with a wave of the hand. He knew there was no logical explanation for what he was about to do, only the desperate faith of a man who would rather die trying than live forever with regret. Samuel studied Margaret's scans with such intensity that even Dr. Morrison paused to observe. His eyes moved across each line of data with the familiarity of someone who understood nuances others missed entirely. "Here," Samuel said, pointing to a specific region on the MRI. "You interpreted this shadow as natural degeneration, but it's actually active inflammation responding to an old trauma." He turned to Morrison, his voice steady, his presence suddenly commanding. "Doctor, have you considered that this isn't a typical degenerative condition, but a chronic inflammatory response, one that could be treated with a targeted combination of neural anti-inflammatories and tau modulators?" The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison recognized that he was hearing cutting-edge medical theory from someone who clearly understood more about this particular case than any of the specialists they had consulted. The revelation that would shatter Richard Blackwell's world came when Samuel Hayes held Margaret's medical file in trembling hands and whispered the words that made time stand still. I know this case because I operated on your wife 15 years ago. The silence that followed was so deep, it seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. Richard felt his heart stop beating for several eternal seconds. Samuel continued, his voice cracked by emotion. I was the chief neurosurgeon at Presbyterian Hospital when she was admitted after that minor stroke in Tokyo, and I was the one who made the error during surgery, the error that caused the microscopic lesion that's killing her now. The words fell like bombs in the sterile hospital air, detonating Richard's reality into 1,000 irreparable fragments. Dr. Morrison let out a muffled gasp as the truth revealed itself in all its devastating cruelty. The homeless man Richard had brought into the hospital was the very doctor responsible for Margaret's terminal condition. I tried to remove a small clot, Samuel confessed, silent tears streaming down a face eroded by time and guilt. But my hand trembled for a fraction of a second. I created a lesion, only 2 millimeters wide, so small it didn't even appear in the post-op scans. But it was enough to start the process that's now consuming her life. Richard felt the world spin around him, realizing that the man who had offered salvation was, in fact, the architect of his wife's destruction. A cruelty so absurd it seemed written by a sadistic god amused by human suffering. The weight of that truth crashed down on the three men like an emotional avalanche, transforming the sterile office into a courtroom where past, present, and future collided with devastating force. A primal rage ignited in Richard's chest, the kind of fury that could drive a man to the most extreme actions. He raised his clenched fists toward Samuel, but something in the ex-doctor's shattered eyes made him pause. This was not a man who had caused harm through negligence or arrogance. This was someone who had carried the weight of a single mistake for 15 years. A burden so immense it had transformed a respected surgeon into a ghost wandering the cold streets. "You destroyed my life," Richard whispered hoarsely. "You killed the only person I ever truly loved, and now you have the audacity to show up, offering salvation." Samuel Hayes didn't try to defend himself. He didn't flinch. He accepted each word like a lash against a soul already torn to shreds. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he murmured. "I've spent 15 years on the streets because I couldn't live with what I did. But in all that time, through obsessive study and relentless searching, I found a way to undo what I caused." He opened his weathered notebook one last time, revealing page after page of meticulous research on Margaret's specific case, years of work devoted entirely to solving the problem he had created. "I developed an experimental protocol that could reverse the damage, but you have to understand, this isn't about my redemption. It's about giving her the life that my error stole from her." The words trembled in the air, heavy with impossible redemption and desperate hope. The redemption Samuel Hayes offered seemed to defy the very laws of the universe, as though he were proposing to rewrite the past through science that bordered on the miraculous. With hands no longer trembling, he detailed his revolutionary protocol, a precise combination of neural growth factors, experimental anti-inflammatories, and a deep brain stimulation technique designed to halt and reverse the degenerative cascade triggered by his surgical mistake. "I've spent 5 years studying similar cases around the world," Samuel explained, his voice gaining the commanding authority of his medical prime. "I collected data from patients who didn't even know they were being watched, and I discovered that injuries, like Margaret's, create a specific pattern of inflammation, one that can be stopped if we target 3 neurological points simultaneously. But the window is closing fast." Dr. Morrison examined the notes with growing awe and dread, recognizing a level of medical brilliance emerging from the depths of human tragedy. Richard found himself caught between the thirst for vengeance and the desperate need to save Margaret, a choice that would define not only her fate, but also the soul of a man destroyed by guilt. "If I let you try this," Richard said, his voice cold and steady but trembling with restrained emotion, And Margaret dies in the process. I will make sure you pay for both deaths." Samuel nodded with quiet acceptance, fully aware that he was placing not only Margaret's life, but also his own existence on the line. "I understand perfectly," he said, "and if I fail again, there won't be a dark alley deep enough to hide me from the justice you'll bring." The protocol was ready, the equipment was available, and all three men knew they were about to witness either a medical miracle or a final tragedy that would echo through their lives forever. The miracle that unfolded over the next 6 hours defied everything Richard Blackwell believed about medicine, fate, and human redemption. The hospital transformed into a stage for a resurrection that would touch not only Margaret, but everyone who bore witness to it. Samuel Hayes worked with the precision of a maestro conducting a symphony of life. His hands, once thought lost to time and trauma, moved with a renewed steadiness, executing his protocol with a focus that transcended ordinary medicine. Margaret responded with astonishing resilience. The neural inflammation began to subside, the tau proteins ceased their accumulation, and slowly, miraculously, she began to regain consciousness. When she opened her eyes for the first time in weeks and whispered Richard's name, tears streamed down the billionaire's face like rain after a long, parching drought. He knew then that he was witnessing not just the healing of his wife, but the redemption of a man who had carried a lifetime of guilt that would have crushed any ordinary soul. What followed brought not only Richard to tears, but transformed the lives of everyone entangled in that story of impossible forgiveness and second chances. Samuel Hayes didn't just save Margaret, he saved himself in the process, recovering not only his medical brilliance, but the humanity he had lost to the cold streets of guilt and shame. Driven by a gratitude few men ever know, Richard ensured Samuel regained his medical license. But he went further. He established a neurological research foundation in Samuel's name. The Hayes Blackwell Foundation became a world-renowned center for reparative neurology, where former veterans with PTSD found purpose in saving others, proving that sometimes the most wounded among us carry precisely the wisdom the world needs to heal. And Margaret, fully recovered, chose to dedicate her second chance at life to working alongside the very man who had nearly ended it, and then saved it. Together, they forged an improbable partnership that proved that true love sometimes reveals itself not through perfection, but through the most unlikely acts of forgiveness and the most unexpected forms of redemption.